to our presentation today. Really, we're going to dive into some cybersecurity success strategies for manufacturers. And we'll talk more about that. My name is Jason Rutherford, and with me is Steve Chiles. So we'll get through. Oh, thanks. Next slide. Yeah, go ahead and go to the next slide. So here's our agenda for the webinar. First, we're going to do some introductions so you kind of know our background and where we're coming from. Then we're going to talk a little bit about cybersecurity. We're going to wrap some context around it by talking about the evolving landscape of IT cybersecurity in manufacturing, some universal challenges. And then we're going to dive into some of those challenges that are specific to manufacturing. After that, we're going to go through how do we address some of those challenges with cybersecurity in manufacturing. We'll talk about some of our success strategies, so our approach, and really a big piece of the topic today is going to be driving change adoption for results, which we're going to get into. And we have some recommended next first steps. After that, we'll have some time for some Q&A and some discussion if there's any questions out there. Steve, anything to add there?
Nope, I think that's good. Go ahead and jump on in.
So next slide. There we are. All right, so my name is Jason Rutherford. I'm the co-founder and managing partner of Model Technology Solutions. We started in 2014, and really we started in endpoint management and evolved into co-managed managed services. A lot of that has a heavy emphasis on cybersecurity while doing so. And I'll let Steve introduce himself.
All right, I'm Steve Chiles. My company, The Big Rocks, specializes in change adoption for companies that go through any kind of transformation, whether it's some big tech change, a merger acquisition, culture change, a strategic shift in direction. All those things cause change for people. And what we do at The Big Rocks is we help companies guide the humans through that. I've coalesced a methodology that we'll see here a little bit later called the Big Rocks of Change. We highly recommend that when you implement cybersecurity enhancements, you protect that investment by helping the people get there. So a couple questions I want to toss out at you to think about in the background while we're presenting. First is, if you have experience implementing cybersecurity changes, what are some of the places where people get stuck doing that? The people you're trying to help, they get stuck adopting. And then second is, when you invest in cybersecurity, what is the risk if you don't get high levels of adoption? So think about it in the background. And if you could use the chat feature, there should be a chat button there on your screen. Go ahead and drop your questions into that. If you have questions about anything we're talking about, Jason or myself, toss them in the chat. We got folks monitoring that. And if we don't talk to it in the middle of the conversation, we'll make sure to get to it at the end.
Yeah, great point, Steve. So as the presentation goes on, just drop those questions in chat and we'll address them. Next slide. So we're going to first talk and kind of break it down to the basics, and we'll talk about the cybersecurity landscape as it is today. Next slide. And so I always ask this question, and I get a variety of different answers. So we're just going to kind of standardize what our definition of cybersecurity is today. So what is cybersecurity? And if we unfold it, it's the practice of protecting systems, networks, and programs from digital attacks. And one of the elements to this is it's not just software that's going to fix these cybersecurity problems in an organization. Anytime there's software, and Steve will probably confirm this, but anytime there's software, there's likely some kind of end user impact or some kind of human element that's going to be need to be addressed, whether it's a process or a training or a behavioral change to the end users, right? So when we talk about cybersecurity, it's the practice of protecting these things, but it involves so much more than just the actual implementation software itself. Mm-hmm. So some typical cybersecurity goals that any organization's trying to achieve when they address cybersecurity or new infrastructure or new systems, they want to secure IT and IoT, and specifically IoT is important in manufacturing. In doing so, they also are looking to reduce costs, because costs can be a heavy burden and a lot of times a barrier to getting more secure or updating infrastructure. Which kind of leads us to the next point, mitigating old technology. If you think back, a lot of the systems that are put in place weren't necessarily put in place with security first, or maybe even having security in the context of the application, depending on the age of the application. Oftentimes, we see that people are trying to get some regulatory compliance goals met, whether it's NIST, ISO, CMMC, HIPAA. There's a variety of different regulatory compliance measures to meet, and so this is usually a goal of one of the cybersecurity goals out there. And then ultimately, creating efficiency in the workflow, which we'll kind of dive into how that relates to manufacturing. And Steve, if there's anything you want to add on any of these slides, feel free to jump on in.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you look at any of those goals, can you just see the people behind that? And see how, what if you get, I don't know, 75% adoption of your securing your Internet of Things solution? Or what if you get 50% of your reduced cost? That's obviously not going to be acceptable. So that's why we tie kind of the human side to this, and we make it so important that you emphasize that.
No, that's a great point. Any one of these goals certainly has a human element to it, some of it more than others. But generally speaking, each one of them certainly has a piece of that human element to it. All right, next slide. So when we look at IT and how it is evolved in manufacturing, we have things like devices, networks, data, and systems. Those have been around for quite a while, but those are the things that we're trying to protect, right? And if you unfold the slide a little bit more, we have some common threats, things like malware. I'm sure everyone's heard of malware, ransomware, phishing attacks, and then DDoS, the denial of service, right? And if we keep going, we have IoT sensors and actuators, and they're projected to be 75 billion IoT devices worldwide by 2025. That's only next year, right? So that is a lot of attack surface in the cybersecurity landscape that we need to manage. And if you look at those bulleted list, malware, phishing, and ransomware, and if I can get the next, there we go, those have people elements to it, right? So malware, phishing, and ransomware, some large percentage of the time will come through the door because of a human action or a human behavior on these systems that we're trying to protect. So let's discuss just for a minute. We take the manufacturing side out of it, which some of this will still be very much applicable to manufacturing. But let's talk about some universal challenges in cybersecurity. Things like resistance to change. I'm sure this is resonating with a lot of people out there right now, but people often resist change due to the fear of unknown or the disruption of their routine or their perceived job threats, right? Or the perceived threats to job security, right? So how do we convince employees that these new methods, technologies, or processes are beneficial or required without being in a non-threatening manner, right? Additionally, if we look at some complex systems, I'm sure this is no surprise, but manufacturing specifically has a lot of complex systems, a lot of processes involved, and implementing those changes often require a lot of coordination to do so. And this is true in any industry across the board. Next, we have high costs. So the cost of making something more secure, especially with new technologies, new equipment, things that might be designed around security can be quite a hurdle for a lot of organizations. We have skill gaps that could exist. So as these new technologies or machines or processes come out, they might require different skills or a level of education that does not exist today. So there's a training component to it. And then traditionally, we have this existing legacy infrastructure that it may not be as easy to adapt to some of the security processes that we need, right? Steve, is there anything you want to add there?
I was going to say, this is a good time to think in the background of if you've implemented something like, 16-digit passwords or some kind of new MFA solution or something like that, what were some of the forms of resistance that you got from people? Was there anyone who waited till the very last minute to do it, and then they yeah, and then they panic because they obviously need to do their work, but they're late to the game on picking it up. If you got any experiences or questions about how to address that, just drop that in the chat. I can tell you as a user, one of the things we like to do when helping people through changes, just take the frame of reference of the average user and go through that change first for yourself and just gauge the reaction you have. So sometimes resistance is pretty legit. The example I give is if you're flying on the airplane and they tell you, please secure your own mask before assisting others, there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
Because if you can't breathe, you can't help the person next to you. So put your own mask on first. When you switch over to some new platform for multi-factor authentication or something, you and your whole team should do it first. Get a gauge on how that feels, and then you'll have a little window into what resistance you might expect.
That empathic approach, right? Going through what the users go through and feeling it first, right?
Exactly.
All right, so if we go to the next slide, let's talk about some manufacturing, some more narrowed specifics as cybersecurity challenges relate to manufacturing. So complex systems. So legacy systems and equipment, I stated this earlier, they may not be as easy to adapt to new technologies or new methods. Upgrading and integrating new software solutions can be challenging. It can be very disruptive. A lot of times manufacturing operations, it involves complex systems and processes. So implementing these changes take a lot of coordination on across a lot of different departments, a lot of different people, supply chains might be impacted, things like that, right? And then we have those systems, typically they're not designed for security. So those new technologies, those new equipment, things like that, they simply may not be able to meet some of the requirements that you've set forth or the risks that the business is no longer willing to tolerate. And this initial investment can be pretty daunting for manufacturing.
Mhm.
If we go down the list, we look at regulatory compliance issues. So a lot of times manufacturers are heavily regulated, and any kind of change, it must comply with a variety of regulations and standards and sign-offs and lots of layers of complexity to make this work. We have supply chain dependencies. This could be further down the line than what we're giving credit to when we start designing the new systems and put in place. We see a lot in our manufacturing customers of cultural barriers as well. And so a lot of times this can be a very significant barrier, which I know Steve's going to address a lot more today. But if the culture doesn't support things like innovation, or if it's deeply rooted in some traditional practices or policies, driving that change can be really, really difficult. And then the uptime requirements, right? So manufacturing typically runs all the time. And I've heard this over and over again, that getting a window consistently to just update our machines is difficult and challenging. And so those are a lot of the challenges common to manufacturing that we see in our business. Steve, you want to bolt anything on there?
Yeah, I think I want to address, there's a question popped up from Stuart. He asks, who should own human risk management? Do we have any best practices on aligning HR, legal, and IT on end user cybersecurity training? That's a really good question. The first best practice that I would recommend for that, you've kind of hinted at in asking the question, and that is alignment. Make sure that, in fact, we'll talk about it when we get into our method. There's a step for aligning, and as you talk about implementing a given change, some changes impact all users, some impact other parts of your company more than others. Maybe there's something on the floor that doesn't impact the admin in the office, et cetera. So do that level of analysis first. When you do that, you'll find there's probably an HR component. There's definitely a leadership and management team lead component. There's a basic user component. Always going to be some legal component. And then obviously it's a technology solution. So there's tech. Get them together to agree, what is this change? Why are we doing it? Who needs to know about it? What do they need to do to get ready? Get aligned on those things first. So that's probably the first best practice. The second is the content of any kind of training that you would have would be somewhat dependent on the impact analysis. What are they trying to do that's new? What are you asking to do tomorrow that they don't do today? What are you telling them to give up? For example, they used to have an easy back door, or they used to leave their password on a sticky note. Are you telling them they can't do that anymore?
Right under the keyboard.
Exactly. So it's this idea of put your message together, put your training together in direct response to that change impact analysis, and getting aligned on that before you start talking to people, before you start telling them they have to get ready, even before you tell them what's happening. make sure you know what's happening, make sure all those people are on the same page. So thanks for the question, Stuart.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add to that at all. I mean, from a general kind of philosophy, Steve went into the specifics of how to get that accomplished. But from a general philosophy, the business and all areas of the business and all areas of the business that are responsible for any impact or what will be impacted by the change need to have buy-in, and they need to be all on the same page, right? That's a very abstracted way of kind of what Steve just kind of went through. So let's keep going down our slide here. So next slide, please. And next slide. So let's get into our cybersecurity success strategy. So now we've identified some of the challenges, some of the problems. We understand what cybersecurity is, why we want to do it, what some of our goals are. Let's get into some approaches to be successful in implementing some of this. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So from a very high level, and this is over genericized, which I'm pretty sure is a word, if we use an assessment, right? So we'll start on the left. So at Model, we tend to start with an assessment to provide a list of projects to either mature or create change in the environment. And this assessment is very, we'll get into some of the examples of the assessment. Based on the assessment, we then prioritize, and it's not necessarily us prioritizing. What our role is to provide to you the potential risks or the priorities that we see. And then you decide the priorities based on risk level tolerance and then the budget that you have to make some of these changes. From there, we develop, pilot, communicate, deploy, standard things as you'd probably expect. And then from a monitoring perspective, cybersecurity in general, and this goes hand in hand with any of the technology as it is today, there's a continual reassessment that needs to happen, right? Just think about AI that's come out. And I don't know, a year ago, nobody had an AI policy. Maybe 18 months ago, nobody did. And if we were to stop at that point, we would have never evolved and said, all right, so here's our use cases, here's our acceptable use policy on something like AI. And so the monitor piece is really critical to continually reassess where you're at to address challenges as they come up, because that's the one constant in IT, right? It's change. It's always going to change. And Steve, I see you have some things down there below the assess, prioritize, deploy, and monitor, if you want to go through those.
I do. And then when Model works on this roadmap, along with the Big Rocks, what we do is we try to listen during the assessment of your environment, where you're trying to identify the highest risk, highest reward things you need to address in your environment. We'll be preparing for the change to say, well, how big a change is that? How many people are impacted by that? What parts of the company, what roles, what personas? We'll start thinking about that so that when you prioritize, we'll design a change that fits the ones that you've chosen to act on first. Quite often, there are going to be more than one top priority, and that's okay, because that also points to a good time to think about, why don't we just sort of generalize how we're going to do this as a company, and let's just create our own internal best practice. So it's a great opportunity to engage your internal comms team, like if you have a corporate comms team or someone who tends to speak for the organization, if you have an intranet site or some way that you work with employees on base communications, if you have a training department or a person who helps people with learning, or even if you have events where you do announcements, designing a change that doesn't just address the first chosen priority project, but starts to create the permanent infrastructure to guide change. That's what we like to do while you're prioritizing. Then obviously the deploy factor, that's probably project, right? Some of them overlapping, some of them have to be done before another one can start. What we'll do is we'll lead the change for each one of those, just to make sure that gets completely hammered in, that we take care of the people who get stuck somewhere in that adoption cycle, and loop that all the way back until there is strong adoption and you can pass that on to permanent support. And that's what we mean by sustain the change. Obviously, you want to reinforce the positive behaviors that they should be taking, and kind of hunt down the last few folks who are struggling and help them get over that change curve.
Yeah, there's probably one point just to note there, Steve, that your point of getting somebody in a training department or helping lead the change, design the change is critical. And we've seen it over and over again where they may not have that mature of a structure in place yet. So things like line leaders or super users, or somebody that can be advocates for the change, we put in place and help actually carry the change out too. So if you were thinking, I'm listening to this, but I don't have that kind of structure, there's alternative ways to get the change managed through the organization.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, because every organization is different.
Yeah.
And not everybody has that kind of large infrastructure for stuff like this.
Yep. So let's go to the next slide. And so we'll talk about that assessment, right? So where to start? So Model partnered with a company called Cynomi, and we use their cybersecurity assessment that we collaborated with on them. And we have this model portal powered by Cynomi. And what we are able to do is assess your current state on a whole variety of different areas. Based on that, we can prioritize tasks based on goals, attestation, regulatory compliance, all sorts of things. But the way that we take that data and what we do with it is we try to make it into a very actionable thing for you, your organization, to do. And so we provide typically what's a quick win, what's a short term, midterm, and long term projects. What do those lists of those projects look like, complete with our estimates for review and approval? And then based on that, we can assess change adoption readiness, and then start to plan the actual change rollout or the transformation in your organization. So if we go down to the next slide, so this is an example. It's one of the assessments, and I just threw the endpoints of mobile devices in there, and I figured this would resonate with everybody. So step 1A, are you up to date with anti-malware and antivirus? Do you have a workstation firewall, right? Do you have an inactivity lockout period defined? So when we say that we're going to assess, we're going to go through a very detailed list of checklist items to assess where you're at today. And if you kind of scroll to the next slide, I think it pops up a new screenshot there. We can get the slide to advance one. There we go. So we continue. There's, I don't know, 15, 20 screens of endpoints and mobile devices. But an example of this would be no more than 2 local administrators, disabling external media connections, uninstalling unnecessary services. So you can start seeing it unwinding to more detailed, more secure kind of fashion. And ultimately what that gives you, so if you go to the next slide, we get what's called a posture score. And this posture score has a radar graph or a spider graph down at the bottom there. It's kind of difficult to read. This says the scores profile. And each one of those categories are things like endpoints and mobile devices, or disaster recovery, change management, disaster avoidance, the lit networks. It goes on, IoT, AI, it goes on and on about all the areas of how to actually implement technology. And based out of that, we get a task list. We go to the next slide. So the task list is something you can then manage, whether it's your team or our team at Model, to say, the first one there says auto updating operating systems, and the status on that's fulfilled. So as long as somebody is reassessing that that's continually happening for all the workstations in an ongoing fashion, we're in pretty good shape. If we look at the next item, it's locking out user accounts after failed login attempts. And that one in our portal here says it's not started. And so that would be one of those things that would have an impact on end users. It's got a people element to it, right? So you have people working on the manufacturing line, they're bouncing back and forth, and they need to go touch a keyboard and mouse every, let's say, 10 minutes. If we set the lockout period of inactivity to 5 minutes, that's maybe something we want to consider. Do we allow that risk, or do we force them to log back in? And if we force them to log back in, that's where the change element would really come into play for something like this. But to Steve's earlier point, when you design the change to put in the technology, that impact should have been identified with a plan on how to handle it, and then ensuring that that is an acceptable way for the line to continue to operate on a daily basis. So based on our assessment, we get a posture score, we get a task list, but then I talked about putting the projects into a variety of categories. Excuse me. So if you go to the next slide. So here's an example for a manufacturing company that we just did based on our assessment. This is an initiative for things like enabling Azure Arc. This was the quick wins. This was our very easy, we could turn this up pretty easily with very low impact on the organization. So enabling Azure Arc for servers, we think that's about 8 hours for this manufacturer. Implement Patch My PC for third-party app patching, that's about 8 hours to implement. Standardizing existing Windows 10 endpoints on 22H2, about 10 hours to implement. And then we had a target completion date in there. So this is an example of a list of priorities and initiatives that we would provide to our client, so the manufacturing organization, say, are any of these areas you want to adjust or to make improvements on to mature down the roadmap? And if we keep going, we'll go down and we'll see that things like Entra password protection, Defender for identity with on-prem AD integration, PIM for admin roles and admins. So some of these are starting to have human elements now, right? So these are a little bit longer initiatives. These are what I would classify as short-term initiatives. We have completion targets in Q1, estimated hours about what it's going to take for this specific organization to get cleaned up. And if we go to the next slide, this is more of our longer term initiatives. So an Active Directory cleanup and upgrade the existing domain controllers, right? That's going to require some potential level of outage or system downtime. There's a domain migration, consolidating some backups through Acronis that they have. Some of these have bigger impacts. Some of them are just longer from an hours perspective, et cetera. But this is us taking from an assessment of where do we start? How do we break it down into palatable chunks that we can manage our, not only the implementation of the technology, but the actual change among the users with the impact it's gonna have on them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we go to the next slide, I think, Steve, we're going to kick it over to you to talk about the levels of change adoption.
Sure. And so all the things that Jason mentioned, I think, depending on kind of the makeup of the audience today, I'm sure some of you looked at that list and go, I could do that. I need help to do that. I have a guy who does that. She can do that. While they all might make technical sense, especially if you're already in an environment and you're up and running, and you're just making adjustments and enhancements to it, don't forget, some of those things have a significant impact on the user experience for some of the folks in your organization. And you're not going to get the payback on that investment unless they actually adopt and use that. So what we like to say is achieving the high levels of adoption, that's critical, especially if they're not adopting it actually has a negative impact on your ability to function. For example, if someone doesn't adopt the change, maybe they lose the ability to do approvals in some workflow. Well, that's not good because now it starts affecting operations. So there's all these different things, like maybe they don't have access to the system to do their task. So remember, high levels of adoption, that's kind of a non-negotiable in cybersecurity. It's also a non-negotiable in manufacturing because it's pretty much a 24/7 kind of world. Let's go ahead let's talk a little bit about what we're trying to hit. We have two main goals. The first is, if you say it's going to take a certain amount of time, anything longer than that starts to cost you money. It costs you money in two ways. One is you're probably paying somebody to help you with this, and it takes longer so you have to pay them. Well, you don't want to do that. You want to get it done in the time that you had planned to get it done. But there's also, you miss the ROI that you had hoped to achieve. If you wanted to knock this out by the end of the quarter, takes an additional 3 months, you missed 3 months worth of potential return on investment by, say, going live with your new workflow or going live with your new system that had this cybersecurity fix in it. So goal number one is timely individual adoption. And every person goes through this kind of change curve. I'm sure by now most people have seen a curve like this that says when people first get hit in the face with a change, there's a slight dip in productivity while they kind of make their way out of it. They have to learn how to adapt to it. They have to sort of see what's in it for them, develop an individual positive preference for doing it the new way. And then as a group, when you all get there, that's fully internalized and the company's productive. So go to the next slide to goal number 2. And in goal number 2, we're talking about an organization on the left where you're, as a group, consistently over to the new stuff. You're fully leveraging it. You're realizing the benefits. All those little green boxes, those are people and teams who are happy that they have it. Over on the right, if you don't manage that change, you get kind of the Swiss cheese looking organization where you can't really tell who knows. You can't even tell who wants it, But you do know there's some people who are openly rejecting it or resisting it, or they're finding workarounds to the way that you had wanted to implement your cybersecurity solution. What we recommend is a very high touch approach that kind of works through those blockers, finds that resistance. Because remember, resistance isn't just because people want to be difficult. It's because you've made their job harder in some way. And to show them how to do it the new way might have a little bit of a learning investment, might need to have a little bit of a support investment. But once they get to the new way, you'll start to realize the benefit. So we don't want that sort of ad hoc, all over the place kind of adoption. We want uniform, consistent adoption as a goal for this stuff. And I've had people ask me in response to this picture, what's worse, open rejection or not knowing? I'll let you think about that for yourself. You can put it in the chat if you have an opinion. Stuart has an opinion. Can you speak to migrating third-party vendor supply chain risk?
Yeah, so how to mitigate that?
Yeah.
So there's basically some due diligence that, and I'll take the first swing at it, Steve, and I'll give it over to you. There's some due diligence that you can put forth to say, if your supply chain vendor mitigation strategy is required in your organization, then you can take things from any number of the regulatory compliance frameworks. So ISO 27001, NIST, CMMC, determine what is your minimum level of requirement of attestation for those vendors to meet to mitigate their risk, and then provide them a checklist or here's what is required for us to be a vendor in your supply chain, and then have them do the due diligence and provide evidence and attestation to those controls. Steve, do you have anything you want to build on that?
I have. And do you notice how when you start having those conversations where you say to your supplier, by the way, you're attesting that you're compliant with this because we're attesting we're compliant with it and you're part of us. So do you see where there's a big change alignment thing needed there?
Yeah.
There's definitely communication between you and the third-party vendor so that you guys are on the same page about the promise. And then what if they need to learn how to do it? Or what if they use different systems and different terminology and stuff? So making sure you're on the same page, that doesn't just happen. That's something you have to reach out to them to mitigate that risk.
Yeah, great questions.
Go to the next slide, which gets into a little bit more about how we do it. Just curious if any of you are familiar with ProSci and the ADKAR methodology. We put this in there because as model in the Big Rocks, when we roll out change and we help people with change, we try to follow what's probably the world's most widely known or most popular publicly available method. And that's a group called ProSci. And I've known the people who founded this company. I've been friends with them for a long time, for over 20 years. And this method, very individually based, just make sure people are aware that you're going to have a change. Make sure they understand what's in it for them. Give them the knowledge, the skills, the ability to do that stuff, and then circle back to reinforce to say, did you get there? Did you get there? What do you need to help? So this ADKAR approach is blended into our approach, which is on the next slide. Starting with 4 ingredients for successful adoption. So it's not just about process, it's also how you think and the things that you hold people accountable for throughout the process. When I mention alignment and how critical that is, that's a part of sponsorship. Get on the same page about the goals you have for implementing this solution. Make sure you have a roadmap for those sponsors. For example, sponsors, quite often they'll get in front of audiences of people, and those people are made up of the individuals who have to get used to this new change. What a great opportunity for them to share what's in it for each of them, and even to share their thoughts on why this matters. So demonstrated sponsorship, guiding them with sort of a roadmap, giving them words to say, but more importantly than giving the words is make sure they believe the words before they come out of their mouth. Then there's this communication dialogue, pretty much a no-brainer. You got to tell them what's going on. Make sure your messages, what they need to know, is clearly captured early in the process. Engage in a full dialogue that has feedback, and go chase down the questions you get from that. Learning and support. Not all changes need learning. Some cybersecurity changes are just behind the scenes. Like you saw on the list that Jason had, some of those things happen in the back room. Users never see it. That's fine. But in the case where they do have to do something different, or a screen looks different, or there's an additional step, don't shortchange their need for learning, and always be ready to support folks if they get stuck. And one of the things we like to slip into this learning and support step is develop a community of champions who really care about this stuff. So go across the different plants, across the different lines, across the different business units, find the people who really support it and get them the kind of information so they can kind of help over the shoulder with their peers when they have questions. And obviously none of this gets done if it's not somebody's job. So one of the fourth ingredient is diligent execution, and that's built into the Big Rocks method. So go ahead to the next one. Now I'll just blow these out without, I won't read all this stuff, but to facilitate the work, the execution of this, in that early preparation stage, while we're assessing the technical feasibility of a change and we're getting ready to kind of gather the data to prioritize, let's also look at what context are we walking into for change adoption. Are people going to freak out when they see this? Or are people going to welcome this? Are they like, thank goodness I can work remote? Or are they going to give you big questions that you have to answer that might even influence the prioritization of this project? We go, oh, don't touch that for a little while. So let's get together a change adoption plan based on the things we think we want to do. And while you're prioritizing, let's design a change and a change process for those things that are a priority for you. Start doing, like I said, that impact analysis, start getting ready to communicate, support, offer learning opportunities, and give your sponsors some of the help they're going to need to reinforce. Then while you're executing each one of those initiatives in the portfolio, let's lead each one of those, follow through on sponsorship, follow through on communication, follow through on learning and support, and then circle back to say, are we getting the levels of adoption that we wanted? And then long-term sustaining that change, when you know it's locked in and you know the support has been transitioned to your long-term support group, monitor and address anything where people get stuck. For example, is there a new employee onboarding thing where we need to make sure new folks know how to do this? Or if they came from somewhere else that does it differently, can we make sure they totally understand what we need them to do and why we need them to work that way here? So operationalize that support, make it a part of the way you work. And what we say with clients who do a lot of cybersecurity projects, it's good to do a quick lessons learned at the end and say, well, what worked there? What didn't work so well? And then when you go back to grab the next one to do, you can do it better each time. So that's our change adoption approach. And remember, it runs parallel to that implementation of a portfolio of changes. Anything to add to that, Jason?
No, I think that if you go to the next slide, I think that that really sums it up. The change itself, from the technical or the tactical deployment of the software, the process, the tooling, whatever it might be, it really does need to run in parallel at the same time with the preparing for the change from a change adoption standpoint. The same way with the prioritization, the design, the deploy, and the lead. I mean, without one, the other one is prone to be unsuccessful, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to emphasize too that they can be two different work streams of things going on at the same time. Like Jason and I have worked on projects before where the technical team speaks a language, the sponsors speak a language, and by golly, neither one of them is the language the business uses, right? So there's a little bit of this translation going on at each one of these steps. So being able to work together in parallel, yet you have a little bit of your own lane that you're working in, and you put your specialty into that lane, and it's all needed. It's not like one or the other. You need all this stuff, and you need to have it running together, because you can nail it technically. And if people don't adopt it, it's just a bad investment. Or you can talk all day, sunshine and communication, but if you mess up twiddling the bits, if the thing's not configured right, it doesn't work the way you told me it was going to work. That doesn't work either. So you really do have to do it together. And I'll repeat again, the real magic happens when your sponsorship and alignment match your technical ability to execute and your change adoption ability to execute.
Yeah, it's so true. And I've been on both sides of the fence with projects and, organizations that didn't have a big change adoption process, and they just wanted simple communication with instructions, send it out when it's time to go live, maybe send a trainer out. And a lot of times it creates a lot of chaos, right? It creates a whirlwind of, I didn't know what to do, I was stuck, the line stopped, or I couldn't do my job. Regardless of how well the communication was put forth, it wasn't really a change that was actively being driven by anybody. It was more of a, well, here, I'll show you how to do it. There you go. There's the one time on how to do the change that we put in place. And so, yeah, you nailed it.
Sometimes it's even a simple thing. If you've ever been in this situation where, why do they implement some big technical change or some big security change right in the middle of month end? Or don't they know that it's the close of the quarter and we need to get in there and it's locked down for 4 hours downtime while you do that upgrade?
Yeah.
So it's just that coordination. It's that alignment. It's that understanding that it was all the way back to Stuart's question way back at the start. How do you make sure these groups are all on the same page about the stuff? Well, that's governance. You got to go do it. You got to go get them in the room. There needs to be a cybersecurity roadmap. That roadmap is based on an assessment, so you know what the priorities are, and you negotiate with all those stakeholders to say, we're going to do all 7 of these. It's going to go live over this weekend. Does anybody have a business reason not to do it? Those conversations don't happen unless you plan to have them.
And to be fair, from a technical or tactical standpoint, we're usually pretty deep in the weeds. So for us to stick our head out and say, what's the business need at this period in time, in this calendar month, or at this date, it's difficult for us. And so having somebody being able to translate the business needs to the tactical team, and then relay that message the other way is critical to making it successful. So I threw my email address on there. I can be reached at jason.rutherford@model-technology.com for any questions or follow-ups, and I will certainly get those to Steve. And then you can find us at model-technology.com. So thanks everyone for your time. I hope it was beneficial, and we'll see you on the next webinar.
Yeah, tell your friends, have them call up Model. Let's get started helping you with that cybersecurity assessment.